Hello and welcome to the Being Human podcast. Today I have a really special guest, Dr. Brad Wilcox. You might recognize that name. I hope you do. He is an author and a professor. He's a sociologist at the University of Virginia. And he's got a recent book out called Get Married: Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. This is a great book, and he's doing such amazing work bringing a foundation of Catholic faith to the world of sociology, which is not always filled with a Christocentric or Christo-friendly approach to how to be human and live life. So we talk a little bit about the integration of science with our philosophy and faith of our Catholic worldview, and what it's like to have a vocation where we get to do this kind of work and research and bring these kinds of things into the workplace, and then how that affects our family life. And he shares a lot more about the details of the data that's come up from the work that he does. And he's found some really interesting, fascinating data points from across the world, different cultures, of what is good for family life, what is good for parenting, what is good for marriage. So I hope this blesses you. Check out our show notes for all the links to everything that Dr. Brad Wilcox is doing and everything we talk about in the show. Enjoy. I spent the last 10 years learning how to help people using the best techniques available in psychology integrated with the Catholic faith. Now we've figured out that there's a better way to help people than just slapping a Catholic label on the same secular model of therapy you find anywhere else. The real question is, how will we make this shift to a new model of truly Catholic accompaniment, keeping the psychological sciences in mind while opening up to a more human and more effective approach? This podcast is here to give you the answer. Join me and follow along as I take you behind the scenes of what this new model looks like, using recorded audio from sessions working with my team, with colleagues, and even directly with clients. My name is Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I want to welcome you to the Being Human podcast. All right, welcome, Dr. Brad Wilcox. Thanks so much for being here with us. How's it going?
It's going well, Dr. Greg. Thanks for having me on today. Appreciate it.
Sure thing. So first of all, let's just get started with a little bit of what you've been doing the rounds and sort of what you're in the public eye and the spotlight right now for. I actually just saw you were on is it Chris Williamson, the Modern Wisdom podcast?
Yes, right.
That's big time.
Yeah, no, he's got a great he's got a great platform with, I think, younger men especially today. So that was encouraging to be on with him.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so you've got a new book out. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So the new book is Get Married, and it's on kind of the importance. The subtitle is, why Americans must defy the elites, forge strong families, and save civilization. And I think all parts of that have kind of gotten a little bit of, raised eyebrows in different quarters. The defy the elites point basically is that a lot of our elites, Greg, tend to sort of discount marriage in public, deny its importance, or just kind of not talk about it, and yet in their own lives often are leaving very family-centered, marriage-centered lives. I'm sure you see that a lot in Southern Connecticut, there in New York City. The sort of Forge Strong Families piece is about the importance of kind of prioritizing a more family-first approach to life rather than a me-first approach to life. And then sort of the Save Civilization piece is just to underline the ways in which when marriage is strong and when families are strong, our country and our communities are more likely to be flourishing. That's the kind of quick, summary of 3 key points in the book.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's so necessary. I've followed your work for a while, and I've really appreciated your articles and other writing along the way. And it seems that in a lot of what we're doing in our culture to promote traditional values, they're Christocentric and Christian worldview values. Sometimes they're just generally conservative, and you've been a real strong voice from this field of sociology, which is often really valuable to lean back onto for the people who need that kind of argument. I've been shocked how it's this fight in culture is getting so ugly and chaotic that we also have like this other side coming in from the right. And it seems like the chaos is now, it's not even a normal, simple fight anymore. It's not even just right versus left or conservative versus progressive. It's just like total chaos. And I wonder what it's like for you. You know, obviously, I'm sure you take your hits and you have to deal with a lot of criticism and pushback along the way. But what do you feel now today, like currently, in this sort of more recent milieu of what's happening in this chaotic culture?
Well, Greg, it is true that, one of the striking things about kind of the place of marriage in our culture today is that a lot of voices on the left are hitting it from a kind of woman-centered viewpoint. And they think that the sort of sacrifices and, compromises that women make for marriage and motherhood are bad for them. And I talk about a New York Times writer that says that, married motherhood is game that no one wins. Basically no woman wins. And then you have, as you said, Andrew Tate on the right says that there's zero statistical advantage for men when it comes to marriage today. So there are a lot of voices who are kind of, hitting marriage negatively. But I think what's striking is that the data obviously point in an entirely different direction. There's no question that married men and women are much better off financially and emotionally than their fellow Americans who aren't married, especially married moms and married dads when it comes to that emotional piece in midlife especially. And I think some people are kind of waking up to that fact. And one of the surprising, gratifying things that I've seen, Greg, is that, I've gotten, 4 articles in the New York Times, a bunch in the Wall Street Journal, hits on Fox News, but also pieces in, PBS NewsHour, on marriage and on the book. And so I think there is kind of a recognition, at least in some quarters, the center left, center right, maybe, that, this is an important institution and that we should be trying to figure out ways to, revive the fortunes of marriage in the 21st century. So I don't think to be frank, I don't think we've hit bottom when it comes to marriage, but I think it's certainly possible that, in the next decade or so, we may hit bottom, and that there are more and more voices and young adults who are kind of awakening again to the power of marriage and family. And we certainly see, just on a more personal note, in my own parish church at St. Thomas Aquinas in Charlottesville, which sits next to UVA, it's a university parish, the number of young couples, who are married with kids, living family-focused lives has been increasing dramatically in the last decade. So I do see some life here on the ground in Central Virginia that gives me, some personal encouragement on this particular issue that I'm working on.
Yeah, these developing communities, Pope Benedict talked about this as islands of humanity, which, would arise in the times of darkness to shine light and beacons of hope. It is happening. It's beautiful. I think we need a lot more support, and I'm hoping maybe this podcast can contribute to it, and this episode here. But I have some more technical questions to ask, but I want to get back. I was going to ask you your faith background. You go to St. Thomas Aquinas, I would imagine. So that's clearly a Catholic parish,
right?
What's your background? Your faith background? You went from son of an evangelical chaplain to now Catholic. What's your story?
Yeah, so I was raised in the Episcopal Church, actually, more in the the mainstream wing of the Episcopal Church. And so, I, grew up Episcopalian and attended Episcopal Church in Connecticut for many, many years, not too far from where you're situated now. And then went to UVA, kind of drifted away from the practice of any kind of faith for the first 3 years at the University of Virginia, but then kind of came back to the Episcopal Church as a senior at UVA, had a professor here who was pretty influential in my life, in part in that regard. And then in graduate school at Princeton, came into the Catholic Church, in part because I had the sense that the Catholic Church was more family friendly in its teaching and its social teaching and whatnot. So that was a big, obviously, new chapter in my life religiously, and I've been Catholic since 1995. Obviously, almost 30 years now as a Catholic. So that's the quick summary.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so have you? I mean, you take your faith into your work. How much does your faith really embed itself in the philosophy and the theology and the spirituality of our faith? Is that always in the background, or are you on the front lines in the field of sociology with that in the background, or do you keep those things separated? How does that look for you?
Well, I mean, I take a kind of a natural law perspective, obviously, that is congruent with Catholic teaching, and kind of have an expectation, typically that things like, marriage and fathers are important for kids and adults and communities, and generally find results that are congruent with my with that natural law perspective and with my faith as well. But I'm crunching numbers, and so they don't always kind of like line up 100% in ways that I would expect. So I did a project a while back looking at the link between father presence and kids' educational outcomes in countries across the globe, and found that in many countries kids do better in school when dad's in the household, but not in every country. I was a little bit puzzled by that, since that my priors led me to expect that dads being there would be kind of uniformly a good thing for kids when it came to school, but it wasn't. And so kind of just did some thinking and reading up on those countries, and found that in some places dads don't play a big role in their kids' schooling, either financially or in terms of helping with homework and stuff like that. And those places are places where, not surprisingly, having a dad present doesn't seem to have much of an impact on kids' educational attainment. So yeah, there's a kind of a correlation between my perspective as a Catholic, and as someone who believes in the natural law, some kind of set of principles that would guide human experience and the social world across time and space. But I'm also trying to kind of be very honest with what the data is telling me, and kind of report that as such.
Well, this is such a fascinating question. We work here a lot with integration and trying to integrate the clinical psychological sciences with a strong, fundamentally Catholic, philosophical, spiritual background. And the way we talk about it is like we have 3 channels, 3 pathways to understand the human person: faith, reason, and science. And they're all 3 facets of understanding the same human person. So it's so fascinating there if you see data points that don't line up with your expectations, but then you go back and it's like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like the intuition that comes from what you would expect from the Catholic perspective gives you a lens to look for other variables that you might have missed in the first run of research, other data points that would make sense of the anomalies that seem to contradict what the expectations or hypotheses would be. And so you go back and you find out, okay, dad's presence alone is not enough. Dad's engagement actually ends up showing different outcomes. And so, well, actually, that is consistent with what we would think from a Catholic worldview.
Right. And so, I mean, I want to be careful. As I said, generally speaking, what I find lines up with what I would expect to find, but not always. And so then when it doesn't, I have to do some detective work to try to figure out what's going on here, and how do I need to think about this in a new way, or in a way that would help me to reconcile, my my own priors with what the data is telling me.
I mean, if you're a sociologist in the 80s and you were carrying along this narrative that divorce is better for children when there's severe conflict or any conflict in the marriage or whatever, it's like something has to give somebody pause to say, well, let's look at the data differently, or look at it again, or how could this be true? And another point this came up, I heard you talking about this with somebody else, that the data about fathers and about the marriage itself being better for families, better for kids. And you made sort of a side comment, and the interviewer didn't go back into it, but you said, of course, that's not a carte blanche categorization of just being married is good enough. There is a distinction to be made for good marriages or better marriages having better outcomes. And so even looking at this, I mean, this conversation to my audience is going to be for, we have a mostly Catholic audience or Christian, and at least on the same side of ideas of being pro-marriage, pro-family. And so, I'm looking for what finer distinctions can we learn from within that data to see, okay, what makes a good marriage that actually shows better outcomes for kids? What are some of those variables and distinctions that you found?
Right. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is kind of how do you forge a good marriage? How do you forge a strong marriage? And I talk about 5 pillars in the book. And those pillars are communion, children, commitment, cash, and community. And each of those pillars, I think, are often linked to better marital outcomes. So when it comes to communion, for instance, kind of talking about the importance of forging a we before me approach to marriage, and mention in that chapter kind of 2 things. One is kind of regular date nights for couples to kind of rekindle that sense of intimacy in their marriage, kind of apart from the kids and apart from like troubles at work or, other domains of your life. Uh, the other piece in community is just kind of having a kind of team approach to a lot of your family life and your marriage. And one example is money. And we find that couples who have joint accounts are more likely to be flourishing than couples who keep separate accounts. And the idea there is that having a we first approach to money is better than a me first approach to money, and engendering that sense of unity in marriage. When it comes to children, recognizing that your marriage matters not just for you as adults, but also for your kids, and couples who kind of appreciate that are not surprisingly more likely to have kind of a stable marriage, it looks like from our research. My colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang, has helped out with a lot of this work. And then commitment, I look at that in terms of both fidelity and in terms of divorce. And so, most couples have problems, difficulties, disagreements. And so not kind of bringing the D word into your thinking or even more so you're speaking with your spouse, you kind of, you've made a commitment, you're in this marriage for life. And so trying to keep that sense of permanency and how you think about and approach marriage is important. And also obviously protecting your marriage on the fidelity front from attractive alternatives, both in the real world, but also now increasingly in the virtual world. A lot of couples and guys in particular get in trouble online with, things like pornography and stuff like that. So, or, people not messaging and things like that. So just kind of encouraging couples to, protect their marriage by focusing on their spouse and not letting their attention kind of drift towards other people or other things. And then the fourth piece is cash, recognizing that, steady income is important for couples and families, and shared assets is also, are good. And in particular, having a husband who's employed full time tends to be, a marker of happier marriages for married moms in the book, and then for more marital stability for women as well. So kind of encouraging guys to be intentional about how they approach work.
So is there data about two income families or moms who are working and wives who are working as well?
So there is. It doesn't need to be as much of an issue, Greg, as it would have been, 20 or 30 years ago. It's really more about kind of the husband having a sort of a strong financial foundation that kind of gives his wife the flexibility to, to be at home or to work part-time or work full-time. Again, especially for moms, I see that when, married moms are married to a husband who's not working full-time, there's more challenges there. So it's really more about, and then of course you've got to, as a couple figure out how you're going to, handle the kids, handle your schedule, et cetera. But it looks like it's really more today about, the husband having that strong financial foundation that he's able to offer his wife and the family more generally.
That's really interesting. I think actually going back to our previous point, just about the foundation and worldview and then the research, I think there are great opportunities as well to deepen our nuance and sophistication in the way we believe our worldview is accurate or true. In other words, when there's this like sort of fundamental traditionalist perspective that it's wrong for a woman to work or a woman to have that job or have that role and responsibility, I think it's important to let ourselves be matured by data as well, and maybe challenged to think differently about it, not necessarily to sort of abandon all previous thoughts and beliefs, but just to question deeper and wonder deeper. It's interesting when the data presents an opportunity to ask bigger questions, like what is the fundamental thing, and then that balance between the husband and the wife, and seeing that the data is showing that when there's this sort of backbone or foundation that the husband is providing through work, then that's the critical differentiator.
Yeah, no, that's a great, I think, way of framing the issue, Greg. I do think we're living in a world where More moms are working outside the home, and I think so. I think kind of it's important to try to figure out how that fits in today's marital context, and again, what I've and every couple is going to be somewhat different in how they're handling these challenges and thinking them through. But I think what's interesting about the idea that really it's the husband's full-time work that's more predictive is definitely suggestive of the way in which what a lot of married women are looking for when they have kids in the household is the ability to make choices that they think are going to be good for themselves and for their kids and for the family. And that's in part what having a stably employed husband tends to do for, married moms currently.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about in some of these entrepreneurial, I have some entrepreneurial mastermind type, circles that I belong to, and a lot of them have, they're good Christian, evangelical, faithful communities. And there's this idea amongst a lot of the women that are in these groups that like one of their goals is to retire my husband. And it's like, if I can make enough money through my side hustle or this other thing, that's like the high goal. And that's a great thing to do. It's like, well, maybe you should talk to your husband and find
Sure.
out
Right.
does he want to be retired? I'm not sure
Right.
that lines up.
But I think another kind of point to make here, right, is that if we kind of look back to the 19th century, there are a lot of families, working farms together or running a tannery or a store or whatever else, where the husband and wife were working as a kind of partners, in a productive enterprise, right? And I was just spending some time with a family that I know in Northern Virginia on Tuesday morning, and this family owns a share in a bakery, basically, and a small hotel in Northern Virginia, and and their kids are working in this bakery in the hotel, right? And it was just great to see them all working together on basically a family enterprise that gave them not just income but a sense of doing something valuable and important in their own local community. So I think we also think too, I mean, different models. I mean, the 1955 model, in a sense, was predicated upon dad leaving the home to work at some big business oftentimes, and mom staying at home to care for kids and the household. But if we go back to the traditional family of the 19th century, it's an entirely different model where, yes, there were divisions of responsibility, and where, yes, moms are more likely to be caring for young kids, but they were often working together in some kind of productive family-based enterprise and business. So I think we just kind of look forward, they're going to be, and yes, even today, there are plenty of couples who are working together as a couple to run a family business. And it could be like the one I mentioned, or it could be something that they run, as entrepreneurs, like probably in some ways you were suggesting a second ago.
Or even, I mean, talk about 19th century and the life of Louis and Zélie Martin, the parents of Saint Therese. I like to do psychological studies of the saints and kind of think through, and there's a whole lot to talk about there. But even sociologically, they were both entrepreneurs in their own right. And then Louis, the watchmaker, left his business to go help Zélie in her business, in her lace making in France. She was more successful in her business.
Sure.
And he had left his to go support her in doing that work. So it's very different. And they gave birth to, or they gave, they raised the doctor of the church. So
sure. Right. So I think, there has to be some flexibility here, but at the same time appreciating, that often there are distinctive gifts that moms and dads bring to the parenting enterprise and to the family that our kids are more likely to, appreciate and flourish when they have, those gifts fully expressed. Even when, you have cases of moms, making more money than dads, in today's
really
family.
Interesting. So going back to the father's presence studies that you did, were there any particular marks or qualities of that engagement or of that presence that you saw was important?
So the research here, I think, suggests to us that dads tend to excel in a couple of different areas. Number one, in general, they still, in married families, tend to bring in most of the income. That is the majority of the income. Could be 51%, could be 100%, whatever, but they still tend to kind of lead out in that department in most married families. The second thing that they do is they have a distinctive approach to discipline. Moms tend to do more discipline because they spend more time with their kids, but dad's discipline tends to be more authoritative, more like, this is this is our family role expectation. I'm not going to budge. And it's good for kids to have an experience with that, kind of more authoritative approach to discipline. Especially, I think our teenage sons, benefit from having the presence of a father in the home. They're more likely to have kind of rough and tumble physical play with their kids than moms are, to kind of do the sports stuff with the kids. And that play ends up being, it looks like, pretty important for our kids in fostering better social relationships with their own peers, in school and elsewhere on the playing fields. And then we see too that dads tend to excel when it comes to challenging their kids to embrace life's difficulties and opportunities. And so one example of this was a study looking at how moms and dads were helping their toddlers learn how to swim. And moms were likely to hold the toddler, face to face, eye to eye in the pool. Dad's more likely to sort of turn the kid around and sort of have them face out into the deep, Duke and Altum. And so that was, kind of noteworthy, right? But it just kind of tells us that this is sort of a dadly way of interacting with his children at basically all ages. Like, dads are more likely to throw their toddlers up in the air and catch them. And
Right.
moms often would never do that, right? So the kids benefit from these distinctive forms of interaction with their fathers. I don't think we always appreciate that when it comes to the role of, fathers in the family.
There's so much here. Do you have kids?
Yes, I do.
How old are your kids?
They are 24 to 10.
So did you, this is always an interesting angle in terms of integration, in terms of studying all of this.
Sure.
How much does that enter into your conversations with your wife, your family life, your thoughts about your own fatherhood?
No, it does come in. And I think I'm more of a bookish guy, not an athletic guy. And so, I think learning some of the stuff about like the power of play, has forced me to try to be more intentional about shooting a basketball outside with the kids, or I'm a swimmer. So we do a lot of stuff in the pool with my younger kids too, just kind of playing tag in the neighborhood pool, for instance, or Marco Polo, whatever it might be. And so that's I try to kind of do my part to play with the kids, but that's not something that I would kind of be naturally inclined to do. And so just reading up on this literature has been a spur for me to do that.
It's beautiful to have a vocation and a job where our work is actually improving us in our bigger
right.
vocation, right?
Yes, definitely.
One thing we teach a lot is about complementarity between men and women, and looking at it just purely psychologically, that difference between fathers and mothers is really prevalent, and also the ways that men and women individually can grow and learn from each other is really important from a sort of, again, integrated perspective of marriage as a vocation. And I remember the first time I caught my wife trying to throw the baby up a little bit when nobody was watching.
Yeah.
It was the most precious, beautiful, and joyful moment. I was like coming around the corner, and she was so hesitant, and she was kind of trying to lift the baby up a little bit, but she, we'd had a lot of discussion about this and seeing the good of both, and she was kind of just testing it out to see what it could feel like for her, and it's nothing close to what we can do so naturally without thinking, but all these dynamics, when we bring our work into our family life, it's really beautiful.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And certainly, one of the things too that we've talked about as a couple is the way in which women and men tend to handle things like difficulty and conflict in somewhat different, ways. And so when my wife has been sort of facing a challenging situation at work, for instance, or in the home, she wants me to be an empathetic listener and not to sort of solve the problem. And by contrast, when I'm facing a difficulty, like with a writing project of one sort or another, I often want to just be left alone, kind of go to my cave, metaphorically speaking, and kind of just figure out the problem and then return. And so, I think there was a period in our marriage initially where, I wanted to kind of solve her problem as her husband, why don't you do this or do that, this will solve your challenge. She was teaching at a difficult school, for instance, early on in her marriage. And she would be like, why is he not saying anything, about, whatever is going on in his head? And But as we've gotten older and wiser, we appreciate, and as I've read some of the research too on gender differences in marriage, come to appreciate that we often, handle, these challenges in our life in different ways and are looking for different things from our spouse in the midst of a challenging situation.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And then, the sort of trickle down effect of that being the way we parent. I wonder if there's research too to show, I know for myself as a dad, learning how to be, more vulnerable and empathetic from interacting with my wife, definitely set me up for success more than not if I had not had that with my daughters.
Sure.
So if I was, not benefiting from complementarity of marriage, I would not be as good of a dad to a daughter.
Yes. No, I think that's right. So I think that, obviously there's a reciprocal character to being a good father and a good husband. And, oftentimes our wives can teach us things that make us more successful in, for instance, in relating to our teenage daughters, I would say.
So you had a previous book about raising teenagers, right?
No, I have a book on gender and parenthood that kind of charts out some of the differences we see and similarities too between moms and dads, but not one specifically on raising teens. No.
Okay, I thought I saw. Actually, I think is there another professor?
So there's a Brad Wilcox, who is a professor at BYU, who's written a number of books that are family related too. So it can be confusing kind of between the BYU Brad Wilcox and the UVA Brad Wilcox.
Oh yeah, and he's LDS, right?
That's
an important distinction here. If any of our audience is looking for resources, make sure it's the right Brad Wilcox. But that's so the gender and parenting stuff, obviously that's such a hot button topic. It's so many things that are coming up now.
Right. And so I talk in my book about kind of the way in which what I would sort of describe as a kind of blank slate feminism tends to want us to think either kind of in a liberal feminist strand or even down a more, third wave, way that kind of, being a father and mother isn't really different one from the other. And, it doesn't really matter kind of, who's in the picture, et cetera. And yet again, I think we see in the research is that generally speaking, and of course there are exceptions, but generally speaking, moms and dads bring somewhat distinct talents to the parenting enterprise, and that our kids benefit from having, that maternal experience and touch, as well as that more paternal way of interacting with kids in the household too.
Are there other distinctions that come to mind? I mean, you've listed a number already, but
I've talked about kind of the distinct things we see with fathers. I think mothers are more likely to be attentive to kind of specific verbal dynamics in their discussions with their kids. They're more able to distinguish like the cry of hunger from, the cry of pain in an infant. They're just tend to communicate more readily with their kids than fathers do. And to have some sense of where their kids are at emotionally than fathers. And we do know there are even kind of neurological differences between women and men that seem to correspond to some of these differences between moms and dads and how they relate to their children. So as some of the science mounts in this department, Greg, I think we are seeing that that we can understand a bit more why, many of our more classic assumptions about marriage and motherhood and fatherhood actually correspond to the biological realities that we see in greater detail or with greater precision today.
Yes, that's fascinating. I wonder, because in psychology, even though the data lines up and it seems to support more and more that more traditional perspective, the field itself is amiss with all the political ideology and everything else that's happening. I'm wondering, from your perspective in sociology and the research and the conferences and the organizations that you belong to, what's the trend?
Well, I think it's, on the one hand, I think there's been a move, in academia towards a radically progressive position, although it's often kind of really held to and articulated by a minority of faculty in any given department in any given university or college. They tend to have kind of an outsized influence on the trajectory of the university and the college. But I do think that in recent years, there's been kind of a swing back unfolding where a lot of administrators are kind of trying to incorporate more diverse voices intellectually into departments and colleges and universities, and taking free speech and academic freedom more seriously, and taming down some of the more radical elements. And then the other piece here is we're now seeing new schools of civic life that are open to conservative voices in the academy, that are taking off in Florida and North Carolina and Texas and in Ohio State and Tennessee, for instance. So I do think that the academy is becoming more diverse in an intellectual sense in ways that are good. So that's an encouraging sign.
That's wonderful to hear. I have to be honest, learning, in terms of like the church of the writings from the 70s, 80s, 90s, sociology was kind of the replacement ethic for culture based on this postmodern relativism. And it was kind of swept up in the same disdain with psychology, I think, with like sort of Rogerian relativism and, hoping for more diversity, allowing for traditional, more conservative voices. But in psychology, it's not happening in that way. I mean, the American Psychological Association, at the same time that Tavistock was closing down in England and the Cass Review was being published, APA was publishing statements on, holding fast to the ground of gender-affirming care, and this is our obligation and duty as members of the APA to promote and uphold these rights that people have. And it's mind-blowing that there's such a holdout. But then, it's just wonderful to hear that that's not necessarily the case in modern sociology.
Right. I'm not talking about a majority move, but I'm just saying that, and I'm not going to name names, but, I know a young couple who are Catholic sociologists and, just getting their careers launched. So we're by no means a majority in sociology, but I think there are more voices that are going to give us important things to hear in the near future.
That's wonderful. What are you working on now besides publicizing the book that I hope everybody goes out and gets? It's available in all the major outlets. Is it an audiobook as well already?
It is an audiobook, yeah. So you can get it, in any number of different contexts at Amazon and elsewhere. So the main thing that I'm working on right now is some work on trying to address the marriage penalty in a lot of our federal public policies. Medicaid is the biggest problem here. So a lot of working class couples have to kind of pick between getting access to health insurance through Medicaid and getting married when it comes to their young families, and trying to address that problem. And then also working with a couple of states to come up with some state-based kind of guides to family policy, which is like Texas and in Ohio. So that's on deck as well.
That's wonderful. Have you done much in the sort of lobbying and policy area?
So kind of just been writing some on teens in tech. We did some work with Utah last year that ended up in some pretty major legislation that's now kind of spread across the U.S. My colleague Michael Toscano has been doing a lot of work now with teens in tech at the Institute for Family Studies, and hoping now to kind of do more of that work in next year in terms of giving policy advice to states, but also extending that to public school curriculum as well.
Well, that's wonderful, Brad. I'm so grateful for you. Thank you for giving sociology a redeemed name, for bringing the light of Christ and our Catholic faith into the corners of the secular world there. That's awesome. Is there anything you want to point our listeners to find out more about you or get access to what you've done?
So I'm on Twitter at Brad Wilcox IFS, and then we have a lot of articles from a lot of different scholars and public intellectuals and parents at familystudies.org. So I would encourage your listeners to go to familystudies.org to kind of get a sense of what we're up to at this think tank with which I'm affiliated. Yes,
that's awesome. We'll put all the links to that in the show notes as well. I really appreciate your time here, and prayers for you and your work and your ministry and your family. Hope that this has blessed our audience, and please do go deeper into these materials. There's really good data that comes from the science, from the sociology, and these research fruits that Brad has brought to all of us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Greg. Good to be with you today. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Being Human podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to help us spread the word and hear more, please head over to iTunes, leave us a review, and subscribe. as it really helps us to get our content out to more people. Be sure to listen next time as I take you deeper into what it means to be human. If you want more free content and information about what we do at the Catholic Psych Institute, head on over to CatholicPsych.com. God bless you.